So we've had confirmation that the latest Balance Dataslate is indeed coming this week, very likely on Thursday if history is anything to go by. And from all of the rumours, it sounds like it's going to be quite a hefty one, with a load of potential leaks being thrown around about some new and updated detachments for the Custodes and the Orks. Rumours of a sustained hits 2 rule on their shooting attacks for the Orks sounds particularly exciting, as well as a huge number of expected changes from the last data slate. One in particular, which is very much being hoped for, is a reversion to the changes to the Miracle Dice mechanic for the Sisters of Battle. But in this short video, I wanted to focus primarily on the Dark Angels and what changes I would like to see or what I'm expecting to see for them. I don't know if many or any of these will come to pass, which is a shame, but these are some of the things I would love to see in this new data slate, as well as a few generic Marine changes that I do actually think are coming. So first up, we'll get the changes to the generic Marine factions out the way. This is mainly following on from the change in the last data slate, where all non-unique Marine chapters, and by that I mean the ones that don't have their own supplement basically, so the White Scars, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, they get a buff in that they get +1 to wound against their Oath of Moment target. Essentially, if your army doesn't have the Black Templars, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Dark Angels, or Death Watch keywords on any of its units, then you get that bonus. And that was all well and good, bringing those factions that didn't have quite the same choice of units and characters. That additional buff was very well worth it and very much needed. Unfortunately, GW didn't really think it through, it seems, and seemed to forget that Ultramarines also fall into that category, whilst also having a huge, strong lineup of characters. And what this essentially meant is that the Ultramarines could have their cake and eat it, and it's led the Ultramarines storming to the front in terms of Marine lists with that +1 to wound buff for their Oath target, comboing really well with their characters like Guilliman and his ability to choose a second Oath target, or the bonus command points from Calgar, or just their other generic characters like Tigurius. It is just a huge snowballing combo that, as I said, I don't think GW planned for, so I imagine the rule will stay because +1 to wound is still very much needed for those other chapters. I just think there will be more clarity on the limitations so that Ultramarine players won't be able to take it and benefit from it alongside their powerful characters. I also think we will see a few points adjustments to some of the more well-performing units from the main Marine Codex. We are seeing a lot of lists crop up lately with the very impressive Ballistus Dreadnoughts. There are now quite often 3 in a list. They do a lot of work and they are actually quite tanky for their cheap 130 points at the moment, whilst elsewhere we're actually seeing a resurgence in some of the old classic tanks. The Vindicator and even the Predator variants are appearing more and more frequently, and now I think the Vindicator will either cop a points increase, or more likely it will probably catch the same change that the more recent Astra Militarum Demolisher Russ has got, which is a move to D6 +1 shots on its Demolisher cannon rather than D6 +3. Either way, whether they go that route or they just increase its points, I think it is going to have its output toned down a fair bit so that just taking 1 or 2 or 3 isn't quite an automatic decision anymore. Likewise, I imagine the Ballistas and the Predators will catch a small hike, probably nothing super major, but maybe 10 or 15 points each, so that they are less available to bring in mass numbers. Marines are doing okay at the moment, but they're not an especially oppressive faction. I think most armies in general are actually reasonably balanced in the state of the game at the moment, so I don't think there's going to be any huge sweeping changes that completely gut any units. But I do think that there will be these small ones just to try and rein in some of those units that were being spammed in 2 or 3 every single list. Onto the specific Dark Angel changes though, I'm going to run through a few units here as I do think there is quite a lot that could do with attention from GW. As I said, I don't think many or even any of these will be included. It's just stuff that I would like to see and that I think would help the Dark Angels. They are one of the worst performing factions lately as of the latest sort of Meta Monday that you can see on Reddit and that sort of thing. So they do need the help, I think. And whilst they do have some good units, things like Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions are still very good, as a faction, they are struggling. And we'll start off with the Lion, the Primarch himself. At 315 points, some people would say he's still okay. He is still showing up from time to time. I personally think he's swung a little bit too far on the pricey side of things for me. But as I said, I don't think he is awful at the cost. He just isn't super viable compared to everything else you can get for that same value. And when it comes to the Lion, I as always have 3 things that I think they could do with him, with the last option being my favourite. I think he could stand to drop back down to 300 points, would make him a bit less of an investment if you're bringing him in your lists. It is just a nice, easy fix that would mean you could bring him and still have those 15 points to build up towards something else with any other points drops that we get. I don't think it's a huge change, but it is an easy one, and I think it would make him see a bit more play, a bit more often, but would, in my opinion, still leave him feeling not quite as exciting or powerful as he once was. Where they could, instead of just dropping the points, do something to fix him and make him more fun is in one of the next 2 ways. They could either bring back his -1 to be wounded from the Emperor's Shield. This would make him incredibly tanky, which would be super thematic and super fun, and just make him an absolute terror into even scarier melee threats like Terminators or even Imperial Knights. And I think if they did do that, it may actually come with a small points increase, maybe up to 325, just because of that huge extra layer of durability. But there is another option, and it's one that Dark Angel players have been asking for ages because it just doesn't make sense that he doesn't, but they could give the Lion the Deathwing and the Ravenwing keywords. It doesn't make sense that he doesn't have them. He is the master of the Dark Angels. He should be sort of in all aspects of it, but that would be a really big change because it would allow him to interact more with our detachments and our stratagems, things like the Inner Circle Task Force, the Company of Hunters, and the Lion's Blade Task Force would immediately get a huge improvement if he had those keywords, and he would get a lot more play in them. Getting some really nice bonuses like the bonus to charges from nearby Ravenwing units in the Lion's Blade, it would just make so much sense for him to have them, and it would just make him so much more viable. I don't even think he would need much of a points adjustment with that, maybe a very, very minor one, but it just would make him immediately, straight away, just getting those 2 extra words on his datasheet so much more viable because he could use the majority of the detachment and stratagem rules which he's currently locked out of. Now, as I said, there is an option that I would prefer the most, and that is actually I'd like to see a really big change, and I'd like to see him get both of those things. The -1 to be wounded, and both the Death and the Ravenwing keywords. Now you may be thinking I'm a bit crazy, but I'm fully aware they would have to bump his points up quite a bit, maybe 350 points to get that, because he would be incredibly strong. But in my opinion, that's absolutely fine. I don't want a cheap, weak Primarch. I've said this before in earlier videos. I want a Primarch that is a powerful threat, is this huge centerpiece model to add to the army. And I think I would rather have his points go up and him be worth those points than get a small 15-point drop so that he's easier to fit into a list. I just want him to get those buffs and be worth taking, even if that does mean we have to pay more for him. Elsewhere on the character front, we are always at risk of Azrael getting an increase. He is still just so good for what he does, but honestly, I think he's probably safe for now. He is definitely as close to an auto-include as we have, but I think for 115 points, he's still okay for what he brings. If you bump him up to maybe 120, I wouldn't really have an issue with it. I still think he'll get taken just as much. But any further than that, going back up to 125 or 130 would, I think, be a bit of a pain and a bit annoying, because I think the main issue with Azrael is not that he's just so good. Don't get me wrong, he is good. But the main issue with Dark Angel characters is that Azrael seems so good because our other characters are generally not good. So he just feels better by comparison and is seen a lot more by comparison, just because why would you ever bring any of our other characters? You just bring Azrael because he is great. So I don't think he'll change personally. Maybe if we're unlucky, a small 5-point increase up to 120, but I would be annoyed if he went any further up than that. There are, however, some characters that I do want to see get changed, and in particular, those are Belial, Asmodai, and Lazarus. These guys are all just a bit weak for what they bring, and I mean, we'll start off with Asmodai. He's not awful, he's probably the best out of this bunch, I would say. I just wish he did a bit more in terms of rules. He is just a bit unexciting, and like the Lion, I would rather pay a bit more for him. He's 70 points at the moment, for God's sake, which is just almost insultingly low. I just wish you could make him better, even if we have to pay for it. But if you compare him to, say, something like Limates or Astrath from the Blood Angels, yes, they're more expensive, but they just seem so much more fun and exciting and interactive to play with. I'd love to see Asmodai get a bit pricier, but then bring some rules to the datasheet. I would love them personally to bring the Blades of Reason back in some way, even if it was just one additional bonus attack that had devastating wounds or something for the fluff of it. But then I'd also really like if his Exemplar of Hate got a slight buff, maybe giving reroll to wounds or reroll wound rolls of 1 if the enemy you are fighting is battle shocked. I think that would be really fluffy and thematic, and it would tie in very well with his feared interrogator rule to force those battle shock tests onto an enemy. It just would make him more interactive and more interesting and more of a viable addition to things like your Inner Circle or your Blade Guard. Now, as I said, Asmodai isn't awful, and he is still very good and taken somewhat often with things like your Assault Intercessors, so I'm not sure if I expect him to get a change, because GW probably will think he still gets some use, he's fine as he is. But I personally would think that would be a nice change to see. I would like to see him just get a bit scarier and have a small bump alongside it in terms of his cost. Belial, on the other hand, is just straight up bad in my opinion. He's 85 points, and I cannot think of a single situation where you would want him over a captain, a chaplain, or a librarian in Terminator armor instead. He's basically just got some okay melee and some okay shooting, I guess, but then 2 really niche rules that quite often won't do anything at all. His Grandmaster of the Deathwing rule needs to just give his unit precision, not just on crits, it just needs to give his unit the precision rule. And if you think that might be too powerful, then at the very least, keep it as is and keep it on crits, but make it so that his unit crits on 5s so they can proc it more often. It just only being on crits that they get the precision means it will very likely not do much all game long, and you're very rarely going to have it where you actually get those hits through to actually do any noticeable damage to a character. So I think if they want to go in on the precision side of things, just make it go off, as a rule for his unit, give them precision, or at the very least make it go off on 5s. If they're not going to do that, then just give him a different rule. Give his unit, lethal hits or something like that. Just something that increases their output, but in a more exciting way than just precision on crits, because that just doesn't feel very good most of the time. And then I think his Strikes of Retribution is also annoying, because it's only when he, as in Belial himself, gets hit that it reflects the damage back. I personally think it should just say the wording so that when this unit is hit, it can reflect the damage back, still only to the maximum, so you can't do it for every single model on the unit and do a load of damage back to the enemy, but it shouldn't just be when Belial gets hit, it should just be when the unit gets hit. That would make it much more interactive and just much more likely to go off in a game. If they don't want to do that, they could go the easy route and make it just a fight on death mechanic. Maybe when a model in the unit dies on a 4+, they get to fight before they're removed. That is kind of a sensible way, but I don't really like it. I'm loath to consider adding another fight on death rule to the game. I just don't think they're all that. They're good, don't get me wrong, but I just think there's a lot of them in the game, so I don't really want to see another one. I think keeping the rule as it is for Belial, but just making it so that the reflected damage is done whenever his unit takes damage rather than just Belial himself, would make it much, much better. Lazarus is another character that I think needs or deserves a slight buff. He does have his niche, but the problem with Lazarus is that his niche is very, very, very niche. And I'm not really sure what they could do with him in terms of buffing him, because I completely get what they were going for. He's like this anti-psyker defense style character. So I don't really know how else they can kind of show that and improve it. I just don't think it does enough to warrant bringing him in a lot of games. It's really hard to justify taking him unless you know you are going up against a lot of psychers. I think maybe giving the helm the ability to give the feel no pain to his whole unit, so maybe instead of just giving him a 3-up against those types of attacks, dropping it to maybe a 4-up, but spreading it unit wide would be quite nice. And then maybe just something simple like giving his sword 3 damage so that it's really, really scary into psychers. I don't know, I struggle with Lazarus because, as I said, I get what they were going for with him and he definitely has his niche. I just think he needs to be a bit better, and I'm not quite sure how they could do it. I mean, they could just drop his points a tiny bit, but again, that would be dropping a Marine HQ to under 70 points, which is just, that feels wrong to me. So I would rather they buff him some way and just make him slightly more defensive for his unit with that Helm Aura going off on the entire squad, or just make him really, really scary into enemy psychers. Another unit I'd like to see change is the Vengeance. Yep, I know, we hate it, we all hate it. It could literally halve in points and people would probably still not take it just because of how much they hate it, but it does need a change realistically. It needs to drop in points. I would personally, if I was realistically trying to change it, I would drop it to 100 points and then give it the same weapon stats as the Redemptor's Plasma. So it is Strength 8 minus 3 AP, 2 damage base, and then Strength 9 minus 4 AP, 3 damage when overcharged, and keep the same twin linked rule that it has now. That would at least make it decent again, I think. It might actually see some play on the board, especially if you wanted to lean into the Plasma side of the Dark Angels. So that's what I would like for the Vengeance. What do I expect? I'll be honest, probably nothing. Maybe a drop to 100 points if they're feeling generous, but certainly not the weapon change. I think at most for the Vengeance, we will see that small point drop, and they'll just leave it there until they probably squat it in 11th edition. Next up, we may have a opinion that is maybe a bit niche, but there's another unit I would like to see get a bit of a fix. They've had a load of new models in 10th edition, so they are proving to be quite popular, but regular Terminators are still not super competitive. And I know a lot of people think that they need a small points drop or some adjustments just to make them a bit better. But I actually, you might think I'm crazy here, but there's one way that I actually think, in addition to a small points drop, I do think they need that. But what I would do in terms of making their datasheet and their rules a bit better, just to make them perform slightly better on the table, may not be enough to fix them, but I think they could easily do it sort of like across all Marine factions. I would give Stormbolters the assault rule. I personally don't see why they don't have it, because as far as my understanding goes, like this is me thinking back to, the old days of 2nd edition and everything, but Terminators with their Stormbolters, they were kind of meant to be assault weapons where they would go in and breach barricades and just unleash their firepower as they stormed into space hulks and enemy fortifications. So to me, Stormbolters always had sort of an assault weapon vibe. So I think they should bring back assault on Stormbolters. Would it fix Terminators completely? Probably not, but I think it would be a really thematic and sensible change that would at the very least help to alleviate one of the issues that Terminators have, which is their mobility. Their output still isn't great, and yes, there are a lot of people that would argue Stormbolters just need a pip of AP or something like that, but I think that if you added Assault to them, it would give the Terminators just a bit more mobility. Rather than just having them rely on Deep Strike, it would mean they could get across the board a bit better, and then even after they had Deep Strike in, if you chose that route, they could get around more to get onto objectives and keep having relevance in the game, because they would essentially get that extra D6 inches of movement. So I think that small change, giving their Stormbolters the assault rule alongside a small points drop, would actually be a really nice welcome change. In terms of things on the Dark Angels front specifically, I would love Deathwing Terminators to get Battle Line as well, especially in the Inner Circle Task Force. Like the Outriders do in the Company of Hunters, I think that would be a really nice change to see and would just make Deathwing Terminators feel a bit better in that detachment. But yeah, I would really like to see Stormbolters get the assault rule. I'd love to know what you think of that, because you might think it wouldn't change much at all, or wouldn't really be worth doing. But I just think having Terminators the ability to get an extra D6 inches of movement may not always come into effect, but there are some games where you think that would be really, really handy. Moving on from the units though, there is also some changes in terms of our detachments specifically that I would love to see. There are a few things that I think could be tweaked with them to help them out when you compare them to some of the more regularly taken ones like the Gladius or the Stormlance. And we have two in particular that are the most in need of a change, I think. The Unforgiven Task Force, I think this detachment needs a way to force a unit to be battle shocked, or better yet, just count as being battle shocked. So maybe adding a rule to it that says that once per turn you can pick one of your units and it counts as being battle shocked for the purposes of enhancements and stratagems. So giving you those extra benefits from some of your enhancements and stratagems on a unit when you need it the most, and being able to proc things like Unforgiven Fury on demand would be a huge improvement to how the detachment plays. That may not be enough to fix it completely when you compare it to things like the Gladius, but I do think it would go a long way to make that unreliable battle shock mechanic that the Unforgiven relies upon and works around just feel better for us and get you a lot more mileage out of some of your stratagems and your enhancements. I've seen some other people say get rid of it entirely and just replace it with a plasma focused detachment. This, again, I like as a Dark Angel player. Obviously, I love plasma, so maybe changing the battle shock side of the rule to just one that interacts with plasma so that you can ignore hazardous tests or get, some kind of benefit with your plasma or hazardous weaponry. I don't think that's very likely because they clearly have their plan for the Unforgiven and where they wanted to go with it. So I think more realistically, not saying that I think this will happen in this data slate, but I think more realistically would be them just making Battle Shock work better for us in this detachment. For the Inner Circle, I think very simply giving the rule to Walker units as well as infantry is a quick, easy fix. Alongside the Terminators as battle line that I said earlier, I just think that those changes would make this detachment feel much better, and certainly in terms of giving the rule to your Walker units, it would give our Dreadnoughts a place in this army and just help them to feel part of it rather than just feeling like they're extra dead weight alongside your infantry. So that would be a very, very small change, but one that a lot of people would like, and I think that would make taking sort of a full Deathwing army feel much better because you would have those Dreadnoughts getting the potential +1 to wound alongside your infantry. I actually think the Company of Heroes and the Lion's Blade are okay at the moment. The Lion's Blade would just get exponentially better immediately if the Lion got the Deathwing and the Ravenwing keywords, in my opinion. But for me, the Unforgiven and the Inner Circle, with two fairly small changes to be honest, could be made much, much more fun and much more competitive. As I said, maybe still not quite as good as some of the main Codex detachments, but they would at least be more of a viable alternative now. In terms of what I'm expecting from the data slate overall, I think we will see the Lion drop by about 15 points. I think Azrael will stay the same, but might go up 5 points or so. I think we will see a drop on a few things, both in and out our Codex. The Land Speed of Vengeance and Terminators may be down ever so slightly, whilst I think things like the Ballistas and the Predators will almost certainly go up. The Vindicators will either go up in points or get a change to the Demolisher Cannon like the Astra Militarum one, so I think that is almost guaranteed. And I also think we will see a big change to Oath of Moment, stopping Ultramarines from benefiting from that +1 to wound bonus, so that won't impact us directly unless you were running a no Dark Angel unit Dark Angel army, but I don't think many people were. That's generally the Bloodless Angels list that you see at the moment, but I do think that change is coming, even if it isn't going to impact us directly. I would also really like to see some slight buffs to the Unforgiven and the Inner Circle detachments, but if I was wish listing, I would like to see the Lion get -1 to wound and both the Deathwing and the Ravenwing keywords. I'd like Belial to get a full rework from the ground up, and I would like Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions to be left alone and safe from any point increases. But those are my thoughts for the data slate. I would love to know what you think is going to happen, what changes you can see coming, both for us specifically as Dark Angel players and also for Marines in general. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.